Hi, I'm Dr. David Day of Samurai Digital Security, and this is 404 Cybersecurity Not Found, tearing cybersecurity a new arse since 2015.
Hello, everybody. So today we're talking about BCIs, which are brain-to-computer interfaces, right? But first, we're joined by the one and only Dr. David Day, who is the managing director of Samurai Digital Security. So, Dave, I think we should start with a high-level overview about BCIs and what they are.
Okay, so as you know, Brad, this is a subject that I have some interest in, particularly since Elon Musk and Neuralink and the media that's surrounded that. It's caught a lot of people's attentions, including mine. So yeah, I'm interested in talking about that. I'm also interested in us talking about the cybersecurity implications, which you know we'll be discussing. So brain-to-computer interfaces. So there's 86 billion neurons that we have approximately in our brains, and each neuron consists of dendrites, somas, and axons. So the dendrite processes information coming in. The soma actually does the processing, which the data's gone in, and then the axon is the output from the neuron. And these neurons are all connected via synapses, and the connections that are made between individual neurons to other neurons, you know, one to many, many to many, and also the strength between the neurons of the synapses is what's responsible for our cognitive processing, our learning, and our memory. So if you've ever done any studying into artificial neural networks and back propagation, counter propagation, those kind of schemes, then you'll be familiar with how the strengthening or breaking or weakening of those links between the neurons is responsible for our learning.
Okay, so all of these things transfer data then?
Right. Yeah. So it's the learning is done by the strengthening and the weakening and the breaking of the synapses between the neurons. So you know these neurons fire, they send messages out, they communicate with each other, and the strength of those communications is either weakened or strengthened depending upon what it is you're learning. Right. So that's you know very loosely how learning happens. So I you know it's a primitive technology at the moment. It's non-evasive. So a lot of what they're discussing currently involves devices that sit outside of the skull rather than inside of the skull, which can read the electrical impulses. So when the neurons talk to each other via the synapses, the electrical impulses that are moving back and forth, and we do have the technology to read those within the brain to actually see that those patterns of activity within the brain. So it's early at the moment. It's non-invasive, although they are obviously talking about implanting chips into your skull, which may or may not concern you. And so yeah, I mean that's where we're at. That's where we're at. You know, we have EEGs, electroencephalograms, which can monitor this neural activity, these electrical signals, and as a result, give us some idea of what's happening in the brain in any given situation. So, you know, if you're asked to do a task or asked to think about a particular subject, then this activity can be monitored, and you know we get some idea of the processes that are taking place during thinking and concentration.
Right. So I assume we've developed some form of application to manipulate that data.
Yes, I think it's in the early stages, right? But we've certainly moved quite a long way in terms of measuring what's happening. So we can measure what happens, and we can use those measurements to control external devices. So, for example, you know, we have situations where games can be controlled by thinking about things, by concentrating in a certain way. And if you're an avid games player, you may have seen, you know, this happening where people have the headsets on with all the connections going around, and then they actually have some form of control via using their thoughts. So we are at that point. That is a now thing, but that we can do that, and it's in its infancy. It's pretty shaky, but the experiments have shown that you can make things happen. You can control your external environment through robotics or through a computer interface by thinking in a certain way or in a certain method. So that's quite exciting.
I mean, I've seen videos of people opening and closing hands, robotically, which is mind control, right? They're literally controlling these devices with their mind. And it reminds me of a long time ago when LASIKs kind of first came around, and my thoughts were, "What, you're going to shine a laser into my eye, and then I'm going to pay you to do it?" It didn't seem right, and it's a similar kind of thing with this. It doesn't seem to be real.
No, it's crazy, isn't it? It feels like it should be science fiction, but it is actually happening now. And obviously, we're not privy to all that is happening because much of this is the development of intellectual property, and those that are in the startups, the venture capitalists that are funding those startups. Some of the universities that specialize in this, such as MIT, aren't necessarily sort of saying exactly what's going on because they want to stay ahead of the curve. They want to particularly from any kind of commercialization, you wouldn't want to give the game away. So I heard just recently about an experiment where people are shown images before they go to sleep. So they're shown pictures of dogs or cats or houses or whatever immediately prior to sleeping, and then when they sleep, first of all, they can look at how the brain responds to looking at these pictures. So they can see the electrical activity in much the same way as I described earlier. And then they can store that as data in terms of, these are the neurons. This is not individual neurons, but these are the patterns of electrical signals that we can see when they're looking at, say, a picture of a dog or a house. And then when they go to sleep, they can monitor again for those same patterns. So if they see those patterns during sleep, during REM, during the dream parts of sleep, then they know that person is dreaming about that particular image or object, or even thought, because even a thought will fire neurons in a particular pattern, which is reproducible. So you can actually read somebody's dreams. So how amazing is that? Because we don't often, always remember our dreams unless we're woken up during it, or we've been trained to remember dreams, and there's ways of doing that too, I understand. But this kind of mechanism could actually, tell you what your dreams are, as long as it's been fed the data beforehand as to how you think and how your thoughts work. So I think that's fascinating, and even beyond that, they're talking now about that everybody speaks to themselves, don't they? We have this internal dialogue. Sometimes we think in words. Quite often we just think sort of with emotion, if you like. Frequently there are words that we think. We do actually speak to ourselves, and those words can be grabbed as well as patterns of thought and stored in a database. So then we reach the point where we think, well, if we can identify individual words, right, that people are thinking about, as well as pictures and images, we're starting to build up a scenario of where we can map a database of somebody's thought processes. And once we've hit that, we're then in a situation where we can use that in combination with, EEGs to read their minds, right? To read your mind. If you have that database, you can do that. I mean, at the moment, from what I understand, the databases aren't identical, right? So there's differences about how different parts of the brains and different people will fire in slightly different ways, dependent upon if they're thinking about the same thing. The brains will fire in slightly different ways. But there's now discussion around AI, of course, now where we can throw in mass amounts of data, and using a variety of different algorithms, artificial intelligence algorithms, we may be able to find a way of having a generic algorithm which can pick out, if somebody's thinking of something, I don't know, malicious, or they're thinking about food or whatever it might be, that we'll be able to do that in such a way that regardless of who it is we apply this technology to, we'll be able to read those thoughts. And I find it simultaneously fascinating and exciting, and frightening. So yeah, we're moving in those directions now, and these that isn't actually science fiction. They are practical experiments that are showing fruits now. So it's coming.
I mean, there's conversation around whether BCIs will be able to control emotions, right? And I don't know about you, but in a certain emotional state, your world is altered and it's a different place. So these devices may not just be limited to reading. Perhaps it can affect the very way we interact with the world. If you feel down, you feel down. But then you could program your BCI to make you feel happy again or feel excited. So you get to choose who you'll be and what emotional state you're in. And that leads to a very complicated set of questions and choices. Instead of your experiences shaping you, you shape your own experience. And who's to say being happy all the time is a good thing? I believe you need the duality of the experience itself to appreciate the other half of it. So what kind of problems and ethical considerations do you think we need to consider?
Well, I mean, just to go back to your point, I think you're right. And this is a subject which I haven't heard discussed much when the topic of you know um, brain computer interfaces are talked about. Is that whole part about the emotional side of it? So, and this discussion from a philosophical point of view has been going on for a long time. What comes first? Does the thought trigger the emotion, or does the emotion trigger the thought? Do you feel down and then you start thinking
Mm,
negatively, or do you think negatively and it makes you feel down? It's difficult to ascertain which one comes first, but I think most people will argue it's a combination of those things, right? So you could potentially make yourself feel better if you're feeling down by thinking more positively. But by the same token, if you're just chemically, your serotonin levels are low, your dopamine isn't firing right, whatever it might be, regardless of how positive you think, you're still going to be negatively affected. So if we move to the point where we're thinking about a technology that could potentially change the way that you think, when you're thinking more positively, you see the neurons that fire, and then you read those neurons. But more than that, if we move to the next point across, which isn't reading, it's stimulating, it's putting it back in, right? That's the fascinating part, and that's not as crazy as it might sound, because as an experiment, that's already been done. So there was an experiment with they bless it, they used a rat, and they taught this rat how to get food, a food it particularly liked, and they grabbed the information while this rat was learning how to get this food, and they stored it in a database in much the same way as I described earlier. And then they took that data, and using another unfortunate rat that had been treated in the same way in terms of it having an implant, fed that data through that implant into another rat's brain, and that rat didn't have to go through the learning process. It just knew immediately how to get the food. So, and that's not a sci-fi. It's not an episode of Black Mirror, right? That's happened already. So that's where we are, with that. But you're right from an emotional point of view. It's like if we're in a position where we can transfer knowledge to a rodent, are we in a position where we can take a negative thought patterns and make them positive? And whether your feelings on that duality, like you have to, if you have to have the downs to have the highs. I'm not sure whether that's the case or not. It seems to be at the moment, but perhaps this may even be able to change that. Wouldn't it be great if you could have the highs without the downs, right? Whether that proves to be the case, we are then moving into the realms of science fiction rather than science fact. But it certainly would appear that we may be heading in that direction.
Well, being able to manipulate our own emotions is one thing, but what that opens it up to a whole world of potential abuse, right? So maybe there needs to be a baseline of operation here. Maybe there needs to be a framework where you can only have a certain amount of hours of usage a day, or taking it a step further, right? When can people start using these things? At what age should that become acceptable?
Right? Yeah,
Is
yeah.
it an 18 plus? It's
Yeah.
It opens up a whole new world.
Well, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it depends. I guess society will have to look at where it is at the time and make those decisions, or maybe really we ought to start thinking about them now. Do you, as you said, should we be in a position where we're allowing, we educate our children by forcing knowledge directly into their brains rather than, than traditional teaching methods, for example. I mean, that used to be a joke of mine when I used to teach at university. I used to, if we're teaching something difficult like heap or stack overflows, for example, and I could see the students were struggling, they said, God, it'd be so handy if I could just go, Chah! and you all understood if I could just throw it out of my brain. But how crazy, right? That joke that I made, now you're thinking, we can't do it yet, right? But it's looking like we might be able to do it at some point, particularly when we consider what we've done with rats. So then you think, well, okay, it would really benefit children. Maybe we can help them learn that way. But then we're also thinking, well, what could go wrong, right? What could go wrong? I mean, if we're moving into the realms of ethical implications, we're already at a point, aren't we, with the with what's happening with or the outcry that happened around the NSA and Edward Snowden and around snooping and the rest of it. Are we going to reach a point where you're concerned about the government or some other authoritarian organization reading your thoughts without you knowing? Now, there's a terrifying thought. if you forgive the if you forgive the irony, not only we're concerned about what people might be able to see in terms of our social media or our internet activity. What about if they can actually see into our minds and read our thoughts? How frightening might that be?
I mean, they have access to our intent somewhat already with the likes of Google, and it tracks everything you do. So if you're looking for red shoes, it knows you're looking for it, right? But if you've ever walked over a bridge and you look down at the massive, the space between yourself and the water, and you may have your phone in your hand, and you're a little thing inside your brain. What happens if I throw my phone over the bridge? How big of a splash will it make? You get those weird thoughts, right? But what if these interfaces could read those deep down desires? How dangerous could that be?
Oh, do you know? Like I heard a comedy sketch by Russell Brand. It was, and Russell said, sometimes I just get these really stupid thoughts, and he said it's like I'd be talking to a really lovely old lady, and we'll be having a beautiful conversation. She'll be a lovely person, a really nice person, and I'll suddenly think, God, wouldn't it be awful if I just punched her in the face now? It's like, he goes, I know. He goes, it's a crazy thing to think. And he goes, but it just bobs into my head for no reason. Because obviously it would never happen. And I just think how awful it would be if it did happen. But I'd picture it. And can you imagine if your thoughts are being, and you can kind of identify little. I mean, with what he's saying there, we've all had some crazy wild thoughts. You wouldn't act upon them, but how terrifying if they could be read. And then all of a sudden the police end up around your house. You're like, no, I didn't mean to think it. It was an accident. I'm sorry.
But there could be some serious benefits of that, though, being able to catch people way before they even thought they would actually do it. When somebody gets through the cycles of doing something bad, maybe it's a premeditated idea. It could be stopped before it happens.
Yeah, well, is it a premeditated idea or is it a fantasy? And I mean, how are they going to differentiate between the two, right? So I don't know, but we're moving full on into the realms of science fiction now. It sounds like something that a movie Tom Cruise should be in, maybe.
Shall we copyright
it? Well, I think it's been done, right? So. What was Inception? That was a similar thing. That was about dreams, wasn't it? But The Matrix, we're going in those directions, aren't we now? But if we do go in those directions, if we were at a point where we can create patterns from thinking, and we can create thought patterns by reversing the process, we could potentially move to the point. The next step would be if you have a brain to computer interface, and then that computer connects to the internet. Or your brain then ends up being directly connected to the internet, and then we have a whole potential raft of situations where I mean, we talk about virtual reality, right? And that an amazing technology, but how amazing would it be if you could actually create hallucinations within people through pushing the data into the brain and firing the patterns that are responsible for journeys and visualization and all of that, and actually create almost like a trip, if you like, for somebody. So there's that side of things as well, and or even if we're at the situation where we can map somebody's mind and its thought processes, including memory. Could we store memories? Could we share memories with other people online, for example? It opens up some incredible potentials, and they sound, and I'm quite aware how ludicrous they sound at the moment. But trust me, if you just look at some of the basic experimentation that's going on now, this is the stuff you know about. This is excluding what's happening with the military, and you're never going to find out what they're up to. But believe me, they're definitely looking at this. Then we're gonna get there. And I don't think we're talking about hundreds of years. I think we're talking possibly a few decades. So certainly within my lifetime, and definitely within yours, Brad, I see this coming to fruition.
I think so. I mean, very, very soon, I believe this technology will almost be otherworldly. But right now, there's absolutely nothing magical about the security aspects of these systems, because they haven't been developed yet. They just, with any new kind of technology, it's commonplace to rush in, build the MVP, get in, show the shareholders the tech, look how fancy this is. But there's not often consideration for security development, and these kind of things, they're integrated systems, right? It's not just one system in a silo. It needs to talk to your smart house, it needs to talk to your smart car, it needs to talk to the internet, and there are so many shortcomings within those systems, and if they haven't been considered, there's going to be some problems. So what do you think?
Well, you're right. I mean, just a couple of things that sprung to my mind before we sort of get into that side of things, because I do think as a cybersecurity company, I guess we ought to talk about the potential security implications of such a thing, right? It just crosses my mind. What if you think something? How is it going to determine whether to act on a thought or not? So, in other words, thoughts are very strange things, aren't they? So I can imagine myself picking up, I don't know, picking up my mouse. Yeah, I can imagine myself picking that up. But I don't have to pick it up. I could just imagine myself picking it up. And imagining myself picking it up isn't the same as actually picking it up. But I understand actually that the difference in how those patterns are created is very similar. Imagining yourself picking something up and actually picking something up are very, very similar within the brain. And I don't know how good they are at differentiating between reality and thought. So what would happen, right, if your brain was connected and it was connected to all your household devices, say, and you were out and about or wherever, and you suddenly thought to yourself, got to be awful if I left the oven on. I tell you what I mustn't do. What I mustn't do is turn the oven on by thinking the oven on. And if you do that, what's going to happen? You're going to immediately think about turning the oven on, and then your oven's on. So I don't know. So I think some of the problems that exists might slow it down somewhat, and I see things like that as being a barrier to the technology actually being implemented, if you like. And maybe I should add a little bit of caution with how soon I think it's coming, because those things have to be dealt with before it can have any practical realization. Moving it now into a cybersecurity discussion, there'll be things I haven't thought of, right? But just off the top of my head, you're thinking a lot of the same types of attacks or hacks that are done now in cyberspace. If we're in a situation where we had a network of minds talking to each other, they're all comparable, right? So you think about what about man in the middle attacks, right? So you say, do you know what, I'm going to send I'm going to communicate some information to a peer. But if somebody can sit in between that thought process, modify it, and then send it on its way, the recipient might end up thinking something entirely different to what you intended them, what the sender intended them to think. If Alice is sending Bob some thoughts and somebody sits in the middle of that and manipulates them, right, before they get to Bob, then Bob isn't getting what Alice is meant to be sending, right? In the same way, is in a networking communication issue with man in the middle, there's the potential for things to go wrong there, and to a terrifying extent if you think about it. And, or if you're talking about somebody opening their mind up and saying, you know what, I did some really fascinating work, please have a look. If somebody is able to man in the middle that and add in some nefarious or malicious content, then that the person sharing their mind could end up being comparable or being accused of things they haven't thought, because it's been intercepted. So the impact becomes greater. Ransomware. Imagine ransomware in the human mind, right? Imagine that. Imagine somebody says, do you know what? We're going to, your expertise, we're going to lock that away. You can't have it back. Your memories of friends and family, we've got those now. They're all encrypted, and we won't give you them back unless you pay a fee. So imagine situations where you could get innocent people to commit crimes, right? So if you can that information that you're imparting, you actually manipulate them and cause them to correct. Does that happen now? I mean, you could argue it happens now, couldn't you? This is what happens with quite often with terrorist groups. Brainwashing, right? Brainwashing would be a real problem here, wouldn't it? I mean, you wouldn't even have to get past the prefrontal cortex and the logic part. You could just shove it straight in there. They wouldn't even. Yeah, they wouldn't. Well, I wonder whether they know now. They don't know now if they're being brainwashed, do they? If it's done effectively, but it would certainly make the job an awful lot easier.
I think there's a spectrum of threat here, just from being able to sit and watch the thoughts or potential transfer from one person to another, all the way up to manipulation and destruction. Right, as you say, like the man in the middle attack, just changing the message slightly just to get what you want. That could be from anything from ideologies to political stances. Or you could go full out destruction ransomware mode and just lock somebody out of their life. For what would you, a fee is not worth your memories or your emotions. No price would be enough to pay. So maybe it's a trade-off. You all of your future brain power, you give 10% of it to us, and we'll give you it back, and then collect it.
Hey, well, there you go. There's the thing. You're talking about giving brain power away. But I mean, this is another one of the discussions as well, isn't it? About the fact if you could, outsource the processing power of your brain elsewhere. So, rather than sit down and having to work out that piece of math or that piece of calculation, you outsource the processing. The calculation's done for you, and then it's put back in your head, and then all of a sudden you just the calculation's in front of you. You have the answer, right? Like some kind of Rain Man-esque abilities there, and then what else have we got? You mentioned processing. What about cryptojacking? Like we have that situation now, don't we, where you can take over a server or a computer or a PC or whatever, and use its processor to mine currency for you. Could that be a thing? Could people actually tap into your brain and use your brain's power for their own nefarious purposes? There's a parallel to be drawn there. Hey, what about identity theft? Right? If you could just rip out everybody's thoughts, how easy would identity theft be then? I mean, you've got all the information about the person. It's going to make it pretty easy to copy them, right? I mean, you even know how they act and what their personality's like. I think there's some absolutely, utterly terrifying prospects there. Including murder. You could maybe shut somebody's vital functions down. I mean, it sounds like we're going crazy, right? And I guess we are having a bit of fun with this now. Let's be honest. We are doing a bit of sci-fi, but sometimes I think you need to see these things on the horizon and start to think to yourself, well, these are discussions we really ought to start having now, rather than when it's too late.
And looking for the future as well for Samurai, I see this as an area that we're going to be doing a lot of work in. And these conversations, it's the right time to have these conversations, because if they don't happen, then we're going to have problems.
Well, maybe you will, Brad. I think I would have gone by then, mate. that might be.
I'm not
that
sure
might
if
be
that's
your
an
problem
optimistic or a pessimistic view.
I'm going pessimistic, I think, with that one.
Well, I think that's a perfect bombshell to end this episode on. Don't you agree?
Yeah, yeah. I've had fun. It's been fun, that one.
Yeah, me too. And we hope everyone listening has enjoyed the ride as well. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you again next week.
This podcast was brought to you by Samurai Digital Security, purveyors of cybersecurity solutions. Find us at samuraisecurity.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter and Facebook. Samurai Security, tearing cybersecurity a new R since 2015.